The city was buzzing with its usual energy, a mix of car horns, footsteps, and chatter from people hurrying along the streets. In the middle of this rhythm, a man walked slowly, carrying an old, battered piano on a small cart. The piano had scratches, worn-out keys, and a faded wood finish, but there was a charm about it, like it had lived many lives. He pushed it carefully, almost as if it were fragile, and he moved with a kind of quiet determination that made it clear he had a purpose. He stopped in front of a cafe that looked lively and welcoming. Outside, people were sipping coffee, talking in groups and laughing. The sign above the door was polished and bright, and the place seemed perfect for music. He paused and looked at the crowd for a moment. His heart thumped nervously, but he took a deep breath and began to set up the piano near the entrance. He arranged a small stool and wiped the dust off the keys, though the surface was scratched and the wood creaked. Some people noticed him and stared. A few whispered to each other and smirked. One man, dressed sharply in a suit, pointed at him and laughed loudly. "You can't play here," he shouted. The voice carried across the small square outside the cafe, and more people turned to look. A few children giggled. The musician felt a pang of doubt, but he straightened his back and nodded slightly, almost as if accepting the challenge silently. He didn't reply. Words weren't needed. He sat down slowly and placed his hands on the keys. They were stiff and some of them stuck, but he pressed carefully, making sure each note came out clean. At first, the sound was soft, a little shaky, but there was something honest and simple about it. The laughter and whispers continued for a few more moments, but he didn't flinch. He closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of his own heartbeat guide him. He could feel the energy of the crowd, the skepticism, the amusement, and he decided to let the piano speak. The first few notes were simple. He played a small melody, one that he had learned as a child. It wasn't complicated, but it had warmth. Some people raised their eyebrows. Others rolled their eyes. One woman muttered to her friend, "Why is he wasting his time here?" The man didn't notice. He was already moving into a second phrase, more confident this time. The piano protested at first with a few off sounds, but he adjusted, making each note count. He remembered the hours he had spent practicing, the nights sitting alone, and the people who never believed in him. All of that had brought him here. All of that gave his fingers life. Slowly, the laughter began to fade. Not everyone was convinced, but some people stopped talking. They turned their heads, curious about the sound emerging from the old instrument. The man played a melody that was soft and gentle, almost like a whisper to the soul. A few children edged closer, intrigued by the unusual music. The man's face was calm, focused, but there was a hint of hope in his eyes. He knew the piano was capable of more than anyone could imagine. One of the cafe staff walked outside, a cup in hand, frowning at first. "You can't play that here," she said sharply. But when she heard the notes, she paused. Something about the sound made her stop in her tracks. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't fancy, but it had a feeling she couldn't explain. The man continued, unaware that he was starting to capture the attention of the people around him. Every note was deliberate, every chord chosen to tell a story without words. The crowd was still mixed. Some people chuckled quietly, thinking it was amusing to see someone struggle with such an old piano. Others tilted their heads, listening more carefully. The man didn't rush. He let the music breathe. He played slowly at first, then faster, showing a hint of skill that contradicted the initial impression. His fingers danced over the keys in places where the piano allowed, and each sound seemed to find its way into the hearts of those who truly listened. A young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom, listen," she said, eyes wide. The mother glanced down, skeptical, but when she heard the melody, she froze. It wasn't just music. It was a story. She looked around and saw others quietly stopping, their conversations dying down. The man's music, coming from an instrument no one had expected much from, began to create a pause in the busy world. It was small at first, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. The man continued, moving through scales and chords that seemed to flow effortlessly from his memory. He had played for people like this before, though never in such a formal, polished setting. Each note seemed to carry a weight of experience and emotion. He thought of all the times people had laughed at him, all the moments he had been told he couldn't succeed. But here now the piano was his voice, and it was speaking louder than any words could. The people who had been mocking him started to feel a strange shift. Some of the laughter turned into murmurs of surprise. The man didn't pause. He played through the awkward notes and the stiff keys, letting the imperfections add character to the music. There was a beauty in it, a story that was both raw and honest. Some patrons sat back, sipping their drinks, eyes fixed on the piano, caught off guard by the depth of the sound. It was unexpected, and it made them feel something they hadn't anticipated. He glanced briefly at the cafe staff, who were still watching, unsure of how to respond. Their arms were crossed, but their attention was caught. The man smiled slightly to himself. He didn't need applause yet. He only needed to let the music speak. Each note carried a piece of his journey, his struggles, and his quiet persistence. He had waited for this moment, and now that it had arrived, he intended to make it count. Time seemed to stretch. The busy street noises faded in the background as people focused on the piano. The man's fingers moved faster now, a melody building layer by layer. It wasn't just a tune. It was a conversation, a message to everyone who had doubted him. A few people's eyes began to glisten, though they tried not to show it. The piano, though old and worn, had a voice that was impossible to ignore. The music was bridging the gap between expectation and reality, showing that talent and heart can't be measured by appearances. The man slowed down again, bringing the piece to a soft ending. He lifted his hands from the keys and waited, letting the silence hang in the air. For a moment no one moved. The street noise seemed far away. Then, slowly, some of the people clapped, tentative at first. Others followed, more confident as they realized what they had just witnessed. Even the cafe staff looked impressed. Their expressions softened, respect replacing skepticism. The man nodded politely, a small smile on his face. He didn't boast. He didn't need to. The music had done the talking. He packed up his few belongings carefully, looking around at the people who were now watching him with a mixture of surprise and admiration. He knew this was just the beginning. The city had heard his music and he had proven something important, not just to the crowd but to himself. As he wheeled the piano down the street, the young girl ran up and pressed her hands together in excitement. "That was amazing!" she exclaimed. The man chuckled softly, patting her head, and continued walking. He didn't stop to bask in the attention. There was more to do, more people to reach with the music that had come from a humble old piano and a determined heart. And somewhere in the quiet rhythm of the city, the notes he had played lingered, touching hearts and leaving a story behind that people would remember long after he had gone. The next day, the man returned to the same cafe with his old piano, determined to try again. He had spent the night thinking about the previous day, remembering the brief moments when people had stopped and listened. That had been enough to encourage him to continue. He knew today would be harder because people might be more skeptical, but he didn't let the thought scare him. He pushed the piano carefully, the wheels squeaking slightly as he moved it across the pavement. Every scratch on its surface seemed to tell a story of its past, and he handled it with respect. When he reached the cafe, a small crowd had already gathered. Some recognized him from yesterday and whispered to each other. The cafe staff were watching, arms crossed, a mix of curiosity and doubt on their faces. He smiled politely and nodded to them. Setting the piano down, he adjusted the stool and opened the lid, revealing the slightly yellowed keys. He touched them gently, as if greeting an old friend. There was a pause before he began to play, and in that pause, he felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him. He started with a simple melody, one that was easy for people to follow. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to draw them in. At first, there were still a few laughs, people nudging each other and saying quietly, "Why is he doing this again?" But he ignored them, focusing instead on the sound that came from the piano. It wasn't perfect. Some keys didn't work properly, and the pedals squeaked. Still, he used every flaw as part of the music, letting it become part of the story he was telling. Slowly, the people's attention began to shift. Some stopped talking. Some leaned forward in their chairs, trying to hear the notes more clearly. The man played with more confidence this time, moving from simple melodies into more complex patterns. He was careful with each chord, making sure it carried emotion. He thought about the people who had laughed at him, the ones who said he couldn't do it, and he let that fuel his music instead of discouraging him. A few children came closer, fascinated by the worn keys and the way his fingers moved. Their eyes were wide, reflecting the wonder that came from hearing something new and real. The man noticed them and allowed a few playful notes to enter the melody, letting the music smile a little. The crowd began to change slowly. Some of the adults who had been skeptical now looked surprised, as if they were realizing there might be more to the music than they first thought. The cafe staff, who had been skeptical the day before, seemed more tense today. They didn't speak at first but observed quietly. One of them, holding a tray, stepped back slightly and tilted their head, listening. The music was different today, not just technically but emotionally. There was a story hidden in each chord, a feeling that reached past the initial judgment. The man's heart beat steadily, and he could sense the shift, even if it was small. People were beginning to notice, beginning to listen. He shifted into a melody that was slower and deeper, the notes heavy with emotion. It was a song of struggle, of persistence, of hope that had not been crushed despite the challenges. Some people's expressions softened. They leaned back, letting the music wash over them. Even those who had laughed before were quiet now, unsure of how to react. The man didn't look at them, he didn't need to. He was lost in the music, his soul connecting with the instrument, and through it with the listeners. A young boy stood by the edge of the crowd, his hands in his pockets. He was hesitant to clap or show any sign of admiration, but his eyes were locked on the piano. The man noticed him for a brief moment and allowed a soft, gentle note to linger, almost like a question being asked directly to him. The boy smiled faintly, feeling a spark of connection, as if the music was speaking just to him. The man moved on to a faster section, showing his skill without arrogance. The piano responded to his touch, imperfect but honest, singing through the old, worn wood. People began to murmur quietly to each other, surprised by the sudden depth of sound from an instrument no one expected much from. The man continued, weaving melodies together, sometimes soft, sometimes loud, letting the music breathe. He didn't force it, he let it flow naturally. Each note was deliberate, each pause meaningful. The cafe staff, who had been tense, now looked impressed, though they tried not to show it openly. Some customers even reached for their phones, quietly recording snippets, as if sensing something special was happening. The man's confidence grew as the reactions changed. He wasn't playing to win approval. He was playing because he had to, because the music inside him demanded to be heard. His fingers moved faster now, dancing across the keys with precision and emotion. Some of the more skeptical adults began to nod subtly, as if acknowledging the skill and heart involved. The music was no longer background noise. It had become the center of attention, commanding focus without a single word being spoken. A woman in the crowd closed her eyes and let the melody fill her thoughts. She felt memories rising up, moments from her past that she hadn't thought of in years. The music wasn't just notes. It was emotion, a mirror of her own feelings. Around her, others were experiencing something similar, a quiet recognition that the man and his piano were sharing something rare. Even the children were silent now, mesmerized, feeling the story and the sounds more than they could understand fully. The man shifted again, this time into a more playful section. He smiled slightly, letting the music tease and surprise the listeners. It was lighter, more joyful, giving the audience a break from the deeper, heavier emotions. Laughter returned briefly, but it was softer, warmer, not mocking. People were smiling, some whispering to each other about how unexpected this performance had become. The man played on, noticing the small changes in the crowd, feeling the connection growing. He then returned to a slow, powerful section, letting the piano speak with raw honesty. Each note carried his past struggles, the ridicule he had faced, and the nights he had spent practicing alone. The crowd's energy shifted. They were no longer laughing, no longer whispering dismissive comments. They were listening, fully absorbed. Some were leaning forward, hands on their knees, completely captivated. The music filled the space between them and the man, building a bridge of understanding and respect. A few patrons who had been the loudest skeptics yesterday now watched quietly, their expressions showing surprise and admiration. One of them whispered, almost to themselves, "I didn't expect this." The man continued, aware of the attention but not distracted by it. He let each chord ring out, filling the air, letting the imperfections of the piano add character rather than shame. The audience was learning to hear not just with their ears but with their hearts. Time passed unnoticed. The city's usual noises were still there, but they seemed distant. People were present in the moment, experiencing the music directly. The man played on, weaving together the melodies, telling a story of hope, persistence, and quiet strength. The old piano, worn and battered, sang like never before. The man's face reflected concentration, but also a quiet satisfaction. He was giving everything he had, and the audience was finally receiving it. As the piece came to an end, the man allowed the last note to linger, almost trembling in the air before fading. Silence followed. It was a heavy, powerful silence, filled with anticipation and reflection. Then slowly applause began. Not the polite clapping of obligation, but genuine appreciation. People stood, some hesitantly, some with obvious enthusiasm. The cafe staff, who had doubted him, now looked impressed, exchanging glances of surprise and acknowledgement. The children cheered softly, inspired by the music they had just heard. The man smiled slightly and stood, giving a small nod to the audience. He didn't boast, didn't ask for recognition. The music had done its work. He carefully packed up his belongings, closing the piano lid with respect. People continued to watch him, some clapping again, some speaking quietly among themselves about the unexpected talent and heart they had just witnessed. The man felt a quiet pride, knowing that today he had reached more people, touched more hearts, and proven again that determination and sincerity could overcome doubt. He wheeled the piano away slowly, the sound of the city returning as he moved down the street. But the music lingered in the minds of those who had listened. They would remember the melody, the emotion, and the story told without words. The man walked with a steady pace, ready to continue his journey, knowing that the piano, though old and imperfect, had once again proven its power, and his own heart had spoken louder than anyone's doubt could ever silence. The next morning, the man woke up before the sun had fully risen. The city was still quiet, the streets wet from an overnight rain, and the air smelled fresh. He could hear the faint sound of distant traffic and the occasional chirp of birds. Today he thought he would play at the cafe once more. But this time he had a plan. He had spent the night thinking about the melodies he would play, the stories he wanted to tell, and the emotions he wanted to reach. He packed a small bag of essentials and wheeled his old piano carefully through the streets, the wheels squeaking over the uneven pavement. When he arrived at the cafe, a small crowd was already gathering, curious about the man and his worn piano. Some recognized him from the previous days, while others had only heard whispers about the music that had silenced laughter and caught attention. The cafe staff watched from the doorway, arms crossed, their expressions a mix of skepticism and intrigue. The man nodded politely, set the piano down near the entrance, and adjusted the stool. He paused for a moment, taking in the faces around him. Some were curious, some doubtful, and some clearly expecting another spectacle of failure. He lifted the lid of the piano and touched the keys gently, feeling the familiar grooves beneath his fingers. The piano was imperfect, each key telling a story of years gone by, but it had a voice he knew well. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes briefly, and began to play. The first notes were soft, delicate, almost hesitant, like testing the waters. He played a slow melody, one that was simple but full of feeling. The crowd shifted, leaning forward slightly, unsure of what they were hearing. The music was different today. It carried weight, a sense of purpose that was more compelling than the previous days. Some people whispered among themselves, trying to understand the change. The laughter from before was gone, replaced by cautious curiosity. The man's fingers moved with more confidence now, gliding over the keys in a way that made the piano sing. Each note carried emotion, a subtle story woven into the sound. He thought of the nights he had spent alone, practicing, dreaming, and proving to himself that he could play, that he could make people feel something with music. That thought fueled his hands, and the music grew richer, more layered. The cafe staff who had watched skeptically now seemed unsure how to react. One of them, holding a tray of coffee, glanced at a colleague and shrugged. The sound of the piano filled the street, soft at first, then swelling with rhythm and passion. People around him stopped talking, some standing still, drawn by the unexpected depth of the performance. Children, usually restless, were captivated, their eyes wide as they followed the movements of his hands. Even the adults who had doubted him began to pay closer attention, sensing something extraordinary in the music. He transitioned to a more complex melody, combining slow, reflective notes with faster, intricate patterns. The piano, despite its age and imperfections, responded beautifully to his touch. There were slight cracks in some keys, small uneven sounds, but they added character, making the music feel alive and real. The man played with intent, letting each note carry meaning. He was telling a story, one without words, and slowly, the crowd began to understand it. A young girl, standing near the front, clutched her mother's hand, eyes fixed on the piano. She felt something in the music that she couldn't name, a feeling that made her heart beat faster. The mother, initially skeptical, was now listening intently, her eyes misty. Others around them also seemed affected. The man didn't need to look. He could feel the shift in the energy around him. People were no longer just hearing music. They were experiencing it. Each note touched a part of their hearts, awakening emotions long forgotten or buried beneath daily life. He played with a growing intensity, layering emotions in each phrase. The piano's sound, once thought dull and simple, now carried depth and resonance. It was not just music. It was a message of persistence, of overcoming doubt and ridicule. People who had laughed at him days before now watched silently, some leaning forward, unable to tear their eyes away. The man's expression was calm but focused, his hands moving with purpose and grace, letting the piano speak in a voice stronger than any words. The crowd began to whisper quietly among themselves, surprised by the skill and heart they were witnessing. The music had captured their attention completely. A few people had tears in their eyes, moved by the honesty and emotion of the performance. Even the cafe staff who had once doubted him were now silently nodding, a sense of admiration growing with every note. The man continued, blending soft, tender passages with powerful, dramatic chords, creating a tapestry of sound that resonated with every listener. He paused briefly in the middle of the piece, letting the silence hang in the air. It was a deliberate pause, drawing the audience in, making them anticipate the next notes. Then he continued, his fingers flying over the keys with precision, creating a melody that was both joyous and melancholic. The music seemed to tell a story of struggle and triumph, of patience and resilience. The crowd could feel it, sensing the journey within the sound, connecting with it on a personal level. People began to lean closer, drawn in by the intensity and emotion. Some held their breath as the man played, lost in the beauty and complexity of the melody. The piano, though old and worn, seemed to shine with a new light under his hands. The man felt a surge of energy from the audience, their silent appreciation feeding his performance. He didn't rush. He let each note linger, allowing the music to breathe and speak for itself. A young boy stood near the back, his eyes fixed on the piano. He had never seen anything like this before, and he felt inspired. He watched intently, trying to follow the movement of the man's fingers. The man noticed him briefly and let a few playful notes enter the melody, almost as if acknowledging the boy's curiosity. The boy smiled, feeling a connection, and the music seemed to grow warmer, more inviting. The man shifted to a slower, deeper section, letting the melody convey longing and hope. The crowd felt it too, the emotions weaving through them, touching memories and feelings they hadn't expected to confront. Some people's eyes glistened with tears, others smiled softly, lost in the story the music was telling. The piano's imperfections now seemed like part of its charm, adding authenticity to the performance. Every note mattered, and the audience could feel that. As the piece reached its climax, the man played with intensity and passion, letting the piano roar with sound. It was powerful, emotional, and breathtaking. The crowd was completely silent, caught in the spell of the music. Even those who had doubted him before were now captivated, unable to look away. The man's expression was serene, focused entirely on the story he was telling through his fingers. Each chord, each note, resonated deeply, leaving no room for mockery or disbelief. When the music slowed and softened toward the end, the audience held their breath, waiting for the final note. The man let it linger, almost trembling in the air, before fading gently into silence. The effect was profound. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The city's usual noise seemed far away, replaced by the echo of what had just been experienced. Then slowly applause began. It started softly, tentative, but grew steadily as more people joined in, some standing, some clapping with emotion. The man smiled gently, standing and bowing slightly. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The music had spoken for him, expressing more than words ever could. People continued to watch him as he carefully packed up the piano, closing the lid with respect. The cafe staff, previously skeptical, now looked impressed, exchanging glances of recognition and admiration. Children clapped enthusiastically, inspired by what they had witnessed, while adults nodded quietly, touched by the depth and honesty of the performance. As he wheeled the piano away, the city returned to its usual rhythm, but the music lingered in the minds and hearts of those who had listened. People would remember the melodies, the emotions, and the story told without words. The man walked with a steady pace, ready to continue his journey, knowing that the piano, though old and imperfect, had found its voice and had the power to move everyone who listened. He felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that today he had reached more hearts, proving that true talent and determination could touch people in ways no ridicule or doubt could ever silence. The day was bright, the sky a pale blue with a few scattered clouds. The man moved through the streets with his old piano, the wheels squeaking with every turn. He had played at the cafe before, and the memories of the last two performances gave him courage. But today felt different. He could sense that something bigger was about to happen. The streets were busy, but his mind was focused solely on the music he was about to play and the story he wanted to tell. When he reached the cafe, a crowd had already gathered. Some recognized him from previous days, and others had heard about the performances through whispers and rumors. The staff watched him from the doorway, some skeptical, some curious, but none could hide their attention. He set the piano down carefully, adjusted the stool, and touched the keys lightly. The familiar grooves and worn surfaces greeted him like an old friend, and he felt the connection immediately. Today he decided the music would speak louder than ever. He began to play, the first notes soft and deliberate. The crowd leaned in, quiet, sensing that this was no ordinary performance. The melody was gentle at first, a quiet invitation to listen. He moved slowly through the keys, letting the piano breathe, letting each note hang in the air just long enough to touch the hearts of the listeners. Children stopped their playful chatter, and adults who had been talking quietly grew still. The man's expression was serene, focused entirely on the music, unaware of the growing attention around him. The melody shifted gradually, becoming richer, deeper, more intricate. The piano responded to his touch with a voice that seemed alive, each note carrying emotion and experience. People began to feel the story behind the music. Some closed their eyes, letting the sounds transport them to memories and emotions they hadn't touched in years. The cafe staff, who had doubted him from the start, now watched silently, unable to look away. The man didn't need their approval. He only needed to let the music speak. He transitioned into a section that was both playful and complex. His fingers moved quickly over the keys, creating a rhythm that danced in the air. The crowd began to murmur quietly among themselves, surprised by the skill and precision of the performance. The music was not just sound. It was a conversation, a bridge between him and everyone listening. Even those who had mocked him earlier found themselves caught in the spell, their laughter long forgotten. A woman in the crowd placed her hand over her chest, feeling a lump of emotion she couldn't explain. A young boy's eyes widened, his small hands gripping the edge of the railing as he watched the man's fingers fly across the keys. The man noticed these subtle reactions and allowed the music to flow even more freely, letting the piano tell the story it had kept for so long. The city noises faded into the background. The melody filled the space completely, making everyone present a part of the performance. The man shifted again, moving into a slow, powerful section. The notes were deep, heavy with feeling, yet gentle in their own way. Each chord resonated through the air, vibrating in the hearts of the listeners. Some patrons began to tear up quietly, overcome by the raw honesty of the music. The children, usually restless and noisy, stood quietly, mesmerized by the sound. The cafe staff could no longer hide their astonishment, their arms relaxing as they watched the scene unfold. The man's music was proving that true talent and sincerity could silence doubt entirely. He moved into the climax of the piece, playing with a passion that was impossible to ignore. The music swelled, filling the street, the cafe, and the hearts of everyone around. People who had laughed at him before were now completely silent, captivated by the intensity and beauty of the performance. The piano, old and imperfect, sang with a voice that was pure and powerful. Each note seemed to carry not just sound but emotion, experience, and history. The man's hands moved with purpose and grace, showing the full range of his skill, yet without arrogance. The crowd was completely absorbed. Adults held their breath, their eyes fixed on the piano. Children clutched their parents' hands, feeling the power of the music. The man's face was calm, almost meditative, yet every movement of his fingers communicated emotion. The music spoke louder than any words could. It told a story of struggle, of persistence, of hope that never died. The audience could feel it deeply, as if the piano itself was telling them the truth about life, patience, and resilience. The man slowed slightly, letting a series of gentle notes flow through the air. The melody became tender, touching hearts with a quiet intimacy. Some people's eyes welled with tears, their faces softening as the music spoke to them in a way words never could. The cafe staff, previously strict and doubtful, were now openly moved, exchanging glances of admiration. The children were silent, mesmerized, as if they had discovered a hidden magic in the world through the piano. He shifted back into a powerful, energetic section, letting the music roar with intensity. The notes filled the street, bouncing off the buildings, commanding attention and respect. The audience was completely captivated. Some clapped softly, unable to contain their appreciation, while others simply watched in awe. The piano, though old and imperfect, had become a vessel of transformation, silencing all doubt and mockery. The man's expression remained serene, but his heart swelled with a quiet satisfaction. He was finally being heard in the way he had always hoped. As the piece reached its final moments, he allowed the notes to stretch and linger, each one resonating with the experience, emotion, and history of both the man and the piano. The crowd held its breath, caught in the spell, reluctant to let the moment end. The final chord echoed, fading slowly, leaving a profound silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The city's usual sounds were muted, replaced by the lingering power of the music. Then gradually applause erupted. It started quietly, tentative, then grew steadily, building into a chorus of appreciation and wonder. People clapped and cheered, some with tears in their eyes, others smiling softly, overwhelmed by the depth of the performance. The cafe staff, previously doubtful, now looked completely transformed, their expressions filled with admiration and respect. Children shouted with joy, inspired by the performance they had witnessed. The man stood, smiling slightly, bowing humbly. He did not speak. The music had said everything that needed to be said. He carefully packed up his belongings, closing the piano lid with care, as if sealing the story within it. The crowd continued to watch him, some clapping again, others whispering among themselves about the unexpected beauty they had witnessed. The man wheeled the piano away slowly, the wheels squeaking against the pavement, carrying the story with him as he walked through the streets. People lingered, talking quietly about the music, the talent, and the emotion that had been shared. It was clear that the performance had left a lasting impression, a memory that would stay with them long after the man had gone. As he moved through the city, he felt a quiet pride and satisfaction. Today, he had not only played the piano, he had silenced doubt, captured hearts, and proven that true talent, patience, and sincerity could overcome mockery and disbelief. The old piano, worn and battered, had become a voice of truth and beauty, showing that even the most unexpected things can hold greatness. The man walked on, ready to continue sharing his music, knowing that each performance could change the hearts of those willing to listen. The memory of the applause, the wonder, and the silent moments of awe stayed with him, reminding him that music had the power to reach where words could not, and that his journey was only just beginning. The man walked away from the cafe slowly, the city buzzing around him as if nothing had changed, but he knew that something important had happened. The memory of the crowd's silence, the gentle clapping, and the tears he had seen stayed with him, echoing in his mind like a melody that would never fade. He wheeled his old piano through the streets carefully, feeling the familiar grooves beneath his hands and the soft squeak of the wheels on the pavement. Every scratch and worn spot reminded him of the journey the instrument had shared with him, and he felt a quiet pride in having given it a voice that day. People on the street recognized him, some whispering to each other, others pointing and nodding. He didn't stop to talk. He only smiled slightly, acknowledging their interest with a nod. He knew that music had spoken louder than any words could. The city had heard his story through the notes, through the emotions carried in each chord. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about connection, about proving that heart and persistence could overcome doubt and laughter. He found a quiet spot in a small square, slightly away from the busiest streets, and set the piano down again. The sunlight reflected off the worn wood, making the scratches and dents glow softly. He lifted the lid and placed his hands on the keys, feeling the familiar texture beneath his fingers. The memory of the cafe performance inspired him, and he began to play, letting the music flow freely. It was a softer, more reflective melody, gentle and thoughtful, like a conversation with himself and the city around him. People passing by slowed, curious, drawn by the familiar sound that seemed to carry a story of hope and perseverance. A woman stopped with her bicycle, listening quietly, her expression softening. She had been one of the first skeptics at the cafe but now seemed mesmerized. Children nearby paused their play, tilting their heads to hear the music. The man played slowly, each note deliberate, each chord carefully chosen. The piano, though old and imperfect, sang with a voice that seemed alive, carrying both joy and struggle. People around him began to notice, forming a small circle, listening in respectful silence. There was a warmth in the air, a sense of shared experience that made the music even more powerful. He thought about the reactions he had seen the day before and in the previous days, about the way people's expressions had changed from skepticism to admiration. That was what music could do, he realized. It could bridge gaps, melt doubts, and touch the parts of people that words could never reach. He let that thought guide his fingers as he played a melody that was soft, intimate, and full of emotion. Each note seemed to carry a piece of his life, his struggles, his dedication, and his quiet triumphs. A young boy in the crowd approached carefully, eyes wide with curiosity. He had watched the man play at the cafe and had remembered the music as something magical. The man noticed him and allowed a few playful, lighter notes to weave into the melody, as if inviting him into the story. The boy's face lit up with a smile, and he clapped softly, careful not to interrupt. Others in the crowd began to smile as well, noticing the small exchange, feeling the warmth of the music connecting generations. It was a reminder that talent and passion could inspire even the youngest hearts. The man continued, moving into a more reflective section. He played with deep emotion, letting the notes linger in the air, carrying both vulnerability and strength. The crowd listened intently, some with tears in their eyes, others with quiet smiles. The piano, though old and battered, seemed to respond to every touch, giving voice to emotions that were universal and timeless. People who had once doubted him now watched in admiration, realizing that true skill and dedication could not be measured by appearances or past mockery. A few people in the crowd began to quietly speak to one another, sharing their thoughts about the music. Some whispered about how unexpected and powerful it was, how they had never experienced anything like it. Others nodded silently, simply listening, feeling, and understanding. The man didn't need to hear their words. He could feel their connection through the attentive silence and the subtle reactions of each listener. It was a performance not just of music, but of life itself, showing the power of persistence, heart, and authenticity. The music shifted again, becoming lighter, more playful, inviting smiles and gentle laughter. Children giggled softly, and adults leaned forward with interest, enjoying the contrast and the dynamic range of the melody. The man's expression was calm and peaceful, but there was a quiet joy in his eyes as he played. He had discovered that the piano was more than an instrument. It was a storyteller, a bridge between people, a messenger of emotion. And in that moment he felt fully alive, knowing that his gift had reached others in a meaningful way. He slowed the tempo, returning to a soft, intimate melody that carried reflection and gratitude. The crowd listened in silence, captivated by the honesty and beauty of the music. Some people's eyes glistened with emotion, others simply leaned back, letting the melody wash over them. The piano seemed to hum with life, its worn keys giving voice to every story, every feeling the man had poured into it over the years. The music was no longer just sound. It was a living, breathing experience, touching hearts and minds without a single word spoken. As the piece came to a gentle conclusion, the man let the final note linger, fading softly into the ambient sounds of the city. The crowd stayed quiet for a moment, absorbing the impact of what they had just witnessed. Then, applause began. It started softly, hesitant, then grew steadily as more people joined in, their appreciation genuine and heartfelt. The cafe staff who had watched from afar nodded in respect, acknowledging the skill, patience, and dedication they had once doubted. The children clapped enthusiastically, their faces glowing with excitement and wonder. The man smiled slightly and stood, giving a modest bow. He didn't speak. There was no need. The music had done all the talking. He packed up the piano carefully, closing the lid with care and reverence. People lingered, some talking quietly about the performance, others simply watching him leave. The sense of connection and shared experience stayed with them, a memory of something extraordinary in the ordinary rhythm of city life. He wheeled the piano down the street slowly, feeling the weight of both the instrument and the emotions it carried. The city was alive around him, but he felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of completion and purpose. He had played, shared, and touched lives in a way that words alone could never achieve. The journey had been long, filled with skepticism, doubt, and laughter, but the music had triumphed. It had proven that patience, skill, and heart could overcome judgment and disbelief. As he continued walking, he thought about the future, about the people who would remember the music and the story behind it. The piano, old and imperfect, had become a symbol of persistence and beauty, a testament to what could be achieved when one refused to give up. He felt a deep connection to every note, every key, and every listener who had been part of the experience. It was a moment that could not be forgotten, a victory that was quiet yet powerful, and profoundly human. People continued to watch him pass, some waving, others whispering, sharing the story of the musician with those nearby. The man didn't turn to acknowledge them. He only smiled slightly, letting the music and memory speak for themselves. He knew that this was only one performance in a life filled with possibilities, and that each day could bring a new audience, a new story, and new hearts to touch. The city had heard his music, and in return, he had felt the beauty of connection and understanding. As he moved further along the streets, the man felt the gentle breeze on his face and the sun warming his shoulders. The piano, carried with care, seemed lighter somehow, as if it had shared its story and was now ready to sing again wherever needed. The man's steps were steady, purposeful, filled with quiet confidence. He knew that his journey was not about recognition or applause. It was about sharing a gift that could touch hearts, inspire hope, and prove that even the humblest instrument could create moments of profound beauty. He paused for a moment on a small bridge overlooking a stream, the city stretching out on either side. He rested the piano carefully, closed his eyes, and played a few soft notes that mingled with the sound of flowing water. The music carried across the space, gentle and reflective, a reminder that every note mattered, every story counted, and every listener had been reached. A few passers-by stopped, drawn by the melody, feeling the same emotions that the audience had felt at the cafe. It was a quiet victory, intimate and personal, yet universal in its impact. He knew that the piano, old and worn as it was, had become more than an instrument. It was a companion, a storyteller, and a witness to persistence and passion. And in the hearts of those who had listened, it had left a lasting impression. The man smiled softly, lifted the piano, and continued his journey, ready to share the music again, knowing that each performance could touch souls and remind people that beauty and talent could come from the most unexpected places. The city hummed around him, but in that moment, it seemed to pause, listening quietly, touched by the simple power of music and the quiet triumph of one determined musician.